very much for that kind introduction. Thank you to my hosts for asking me to talk. Whenever people like Pascal give me such a wonderful introduction and enumerate my books, I always feel or remember the story of Edward Gibbon, who handed his sixth and final volume of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire to his patron, the Duke of Portland, who was not a very scholarly man. And the Duke simply said, "Well, I see we've been scribbling again, Mr. Gibbon." So I've been scribbling for many years. I'm far too old to retool or recycle myself, and therefore I'm not in the business of telling you that war is over. I'm in the business of explaining why war is still part, and likely to be part, of our international system. But the Japanese Prime Minister at Davos last January rather shocked people by saying that China and Japan were in a situation very similar to that of Britain and Germany in 1914. And the point that he was making was not that another great power conflict, in this case between Japan and China, was likely, but it was dangerous to say that it was very unlikely, and it was even more dangerous to suggest it was impossible. Particularly if you think that it is economic interdependence that makes war between great powers impossible, because, as he pointed out, Great Britain and the United Kingdom were each other's largest trading partners in 1914. We're talking about many subjects and many fictions, narratives that are very similar to those that people in my country were talking on the eve of the First World War. We're talking about globalization. We're talking about the importance of soft power rather than hard power. We're talking about human rationality, that's our ability to learn from the lessons of history. These were all the themes that dominated the political landscape, certainly in my country, in the run-up to the First World War. So they're not new, by the way, and partly, in some respects, they're even a British invention. They're part of the story, and they're a very important part of the story, but they're not the whole story. Great powers can go to war if they think they can. And one of the reasons that I'm here today is to explain why I think they can. Let me preface my remarks with a general observation that we're living in a very critical moment, I think, in international affairs. Probably I would be expected to say that as a professor of international relations. We're not, however, I think we're living in a very dangerous era of international affairs, as well as a rather depressing and grim one. It's dangerous not because the international order we take for granted is about to collapse. It's not. But its resilience is being tested as never before by radical Islam in the Greater Middle East, whose standard bearer is, of course, no longer Al-Qaeda, but the IS, by clearly a revisionist Russia that is intent on re-establishing itself as a great power at the expense of the existing order and its rules. It's a lonely and unhappy power, consumed by self-pity and resentment, which are, I'm afraid, toxic, the most toxic of drugs. And then there, of course, is the question mark about China. And the question here is whether China will become a stakeholder in the present international system, which it claims it wishes to be, whether it wishes to reform the international order, and I certainly the international order needs to be reformed, or whether it wants to actually change it in ways that would be seen as deeply disturbing to a country like the United States, upon whom we still rely for the management of the international security that we enjoy. So, what I wanted to do today is explain to you why I think another great power conflict is possible. But let me preface my remarks by saying that a lot depends on the stories that we wish to tell. You've heard a lot, of course, about the Thucydidean trap, in which a rising power like China confronts a status quo power like the United States. That trap, and when General Dempsey became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he said in his first press conference, that was the challenge, that it was his duty on his watch to avoid it. It's interesting that General Dempsey should have singled out great power conflict as the #1 challenge on his watch. Quite right too, because if we think terrorism is a problem, great power conflicts have a tendency to destroy a great deal more, far more catastrophic than anything that non-state actors can throw at us, or even medium powers such as Iran. A Chinese general said 2 years ago, of course, that the Thucydidean trap could be avoided if only the United States was willing to play the role of Great Britain at the end of the 19th century. There are reasons why the British decided to appease the United States and decided to hand on the baton to America that we may go into, if you like, in question and answer session. They told themselves a series of stories which the British are still telling themselves, which the Americans don't believe in, about English-speaking peoples and Anglo-Saxons and Anglospheres and special relationships. If a country can tell itself those kind of stories and actually come to believe these fictions, then we're okay, fine. But I'm afraid that that is the kind of story that the United States is going to have a great deal of difficulty telling itself. The other set of stories that we tell ourselves are about globalization. But of course it becomes very difficult when you have a Russia that doesn't actually believe that it is globalized or it is becoming globalized at any time soon. In fact, as the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said last year, Russia is a minority stakeholder in globalization. Why do you expect us to take this story seriously? So here you have a world in which the most globalized powers do actually believe globalization makes great power conflicts impossible. But they have tended to ignore the fact that there are a great many other powers out there, including at least one other great power, that actually is not taking part in globalization and doesn't tell itself the same story. So narratives are possible. What are the great power conflicts that we need to worry about? Clearly one between Russia and the West. Now that Vladimir Putin, just before Christmas, identified NATO as the greatest threat to Russian security. Clearly one between China and Japan. The possibility of another 1962 conflict between India and China was raised last year by Indian newspapers. The big one, I think, the interesting one, which is very rarely talked about, is a possible conflict between Russia and China in 30 years' time. After all, when Chinese students go to their patriotic history courses, they're not only reminded about the iniquities of the Opium War and Western imperialism in the 19th century, they're reminded that a tenth of the Russian Federation is actually theirs. So China is the only country that claims a very large part of Chinese territory. And that is why 39% of Russia's conventional forces are stationed on the frontier with China. And they are the best units, by the way. The old joke, of course, in the PLA is that we can't defeat Russia if we invade, not because we are not as good as them, but because we won't find them. The Russian Far East is indefensible by conventional means, which is why Russia would have to rely on tactical nuclear weapons very early in any conflict. And of course, in terms of tactical nuclear weapons, Russia is far stronger than China and will remain so for some years to come. The conflict that you're most interested in this part of the world is, of course, the possibility of one between the United States and China. And that is something that we can talk about separately, if you like. The question you're going to raise is nuclear weapons, because that's the very first hurdle you have to face. How can two thermonuclear powers, all the countries I've mentioned so far, of all nuclear powers, how can they consider going to war against each other? Surely nuclear weapons make the great difference. The answer is yes and no. The reason why we didn't have a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States was there were no opportunities or options available to either of them to conduct a war between each other without it going nuclear sooner or later. Today I would argue there are three options that are available to them that make it possible to be in conflict with one another without using nuclear weapons. And these options are certainly being explored, even if they're not being exploited. I think we need to realize that technology is the key, but we tend to be technologically very conservative. And this is always the problem when people are predicting what the next war is going to look like. And that includes science fiction writers who normally have more imagination than most of us. Just to give you an example, H.G. Wells, who for me, after Arthur C. Clarke, probably was the best predictor of events. He wrote a book in 1936 called The Shape of Things to Come. Wells was as good as it gets when it came to predicting the future of war. He predicted the coming of tanks before the First World War. He predicted the first atomic bomb, writing in 1914. He even predicted the coming of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which he called air torpedoes. And then he wrote this book, The Shape of Things to Come, which is impressive in many respects. He almost got the date of World War II right. He predicted it would erupt in 1940, not 1939. He even got the conflict zone right. He predicted it would be over the Danzig corridor between Poland and Germany. He predicted that there would be a Pacific War between the United States and Japan. So he did fairly well, but it's at this point, it's on technology, that he got things a little askew. Because he predicted that the Pacific War would look like the Atlantic War in 1917. In other words, it would be between battleships and it would be between submarines. No mention of aircraft carriers, no mention of air power, no concept of a battle like the Battle of Midway. And non-fiction writers don't do much better. Some of you may be familiar with a book that came out in 1991 by George Meredith Friedman called The Coming War in Japan, which predicted that by 2010 the United States and Japan would find themselves in another Pacific conflict, this time with aircraft carriers and air power. A rather bleak picture of the US and Japanese navies pursuing each other across the Pacific over the horizon and out of history. Not to be deterred, he produced a book 10 years later called The Coming War of China. And now there are 3 books with that topic, with that actual title, out in the market, and there's my own book that came out last week with a different title. The point is that, of course, future wars never reprise the technologies of the past. That's the important thing that I'm talking about today. So what are the technological opportunities that give great powers the option, at least in their minds, of being able to be at war with one another without going nuclear? And there are 3 that I wish to bring to your attention. One is the concept of the Cool War. Cool War is actually a title of a science fiction novel by an American writer called Frederick Pohl in 1981. It's about a future in which energy is the important resource and every great power is trying to sabotage the economies of every other great power. And in this particular case, the United States targets its main rival by manufacturing a flu virus that aims at 30 to 50-year-old adults, prime of life individuals who actually run economies. That's science fiction. Cool War is the title of the book that came out 2 years ago by an American writer called Noel Feldman about the conflict between the United States and China. And it argued that neither can afford a shooting war because it would cripple the economies of both countries and perhaps even threaten Communist Party rule in China itself. So they would conduct a war between themselves, or might conduct, in cyberspace. The Cool War is also a title of an article by David Rothkopf, who is the editor-at-large of Foreign Policy, in which he argues that it has probably already begun. It's an ongoing conflict that seeks to damage the economic health of a rival, to target its cutting-edge technology without triggering a conventional, still less, a nuclear confrontation. And because it's conducted in cyberspace, then we have an opportunity, Rothkopf writes, to keep it at a stable thermal equilibrium. Now, what kind of conflicts are we looking at? We've seen some conflicts in cyberspace already, of course. A 2-week skirmish between Russia and Estonia in 2007, when Estonian citizens get into their bank on Monday, trying to get their money out of the bank machines, found they couldn't get them out of their bank machines. And the country, Estonia, had to cut off internet connections with the rest of the world for 2 weeks. Great advantage of that was plausible or implausible deniability. Cool wars are not transparent. You can't actually put the finger or point the finger of blame at any country in particular. To this day, it's impossible to prove that Russia was behind that attack because it was conducted from 65 different countries using the servers in those countries. The problem with a cool war is that it doesn't have rules, it doesn't have transparency, it doesn't have accountability. There are no summit meetings, there are no standard operational procedures, and it involves, as the Estonian attack did, involved a group called Operation Russia that claimed to be concerned Russian citizens but not Russian state. It involves organizations, most famous of which will be anonymous, that are leaderless, with a flat hierarchy, with an opt-in membership and an opt-out membership. It's what one American strategic writer calls open source warfare. It's a future that we may already be seeing, a cool war. If you go to the heartland of the Google people, they don't talk about cool wars, they talk about a code war. In fact, if you read a recent book, The New Digital Age, by two of the great Google gurus, Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen, you'll see what a code war actually is. So I'll give you a scenario for a code war. It's 2020. China wants to bring Singapore into its orbit. There's a clash between China and the United States. The 70,000 strong cyber warfare group in China hacks into America's military networks. And when the Chinese Navy attacks a Singapore frigate, the United States finds that its systems in its Pacific Fleet are deeply compromised. Not only do the key servers come under denial of service attacks, but even more alarming, the United States Navy finds the Chinese have put a virus into the system that's been incubating for months, if not years. It's a kind of perfect form of sabotage, and in the end, the US Navy, in this scenario, finds that it has to launch its aircraft off the decks of its aircraft carriers, not by computer, but manually, as it did in 1942 at the Battle of Midway, because the computers have gone down. In this war, the secret weapon is a piece of computer code that can be adapted, that appears and disappears, leaving the United States entirely reliant on satellite-based communications. And the war, in fact, ends 55 days later when the Chinese attack an American satellite in space. Now, this scenario is actually a war game that was played in the Pentagon in 2013. It's what the Pentagon thinks a code war is going to look like. Now, for those of you who have been brought up on Clausewitz, it's not Clausewitz 101. But when, of course, I see the extent to which Clausewitz dominates military thinking, particularly in the United States, I'm always reminded of Northrop Frye's wry comment that thanks to the Greeks, and particularly to Aristotle, we have the unique privilege of being able to tell the difference between a comedy and a tragedy. But if we had to rely on Aristotle to say what an opera was, or a movie, or a puppet play, then we would find ourselves in the position of Renaissance doctors who refused to treat syphilis because it didn't appear in the works of the greatest Greek medical writer, Galen, who knew nothing, of course, about it. And that's why Northrop Frye insisted we should be allowed to live in our own conceptual worlds and not be condemned to live in the conceptual worlds of people who lived 150 years ago. Clausewitz knew nothing of cyberspace, he knew nothing about space, he had nothing to say about naval warfare or economics in his own day. We, I'm afraid, have to deal with war as it evolves, as it adapts. And I think, like the Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, we know pornography when we see it. War does not have to be kinetic. It does not have to involve loss of life. It is about coercion. And even some of the metaphors that Clausewitz has used is to describe wars, such as war as a duel between two protagonists, or a wrestling match between two people, or a clash of wills between two states or two societies, do not necessarily dictate lethal action. And what would a clash of wills between two great powers look like who were involved in a code war? Well, it would be essentially hemorrhaging away the technological lead of the country that has it, for example, in silence-running submarines and satellite technology and stealth power, and making it impossible for that country to resort to a conventional war as a practical option. That is not Clausewitz 101, that is Sun Tzu 101, to win without fighting, and to ensure that the enemy's army is useless before battle is commenced. Now, this is a dangerous world. The security chief strategy officer of Microsoft thinks it's a very dangerous world. This is what he writes about it. The lack of attribution allows countries to act recklessly, online, in a way that they would never consider acting recklessly offline. Missiles need vapor trails. Cyber attacks do not. We only got through the Cold War, he reminds us, because we adopted something called mutual assured destruction with its rules, its codes, its conventions, its unwritten understandings. At the moment, NATO is trying to produce something like mutual assured destruction, NATO School, Cyber School in Estonia, in the hope that the great powers will sign up to a rule-bound cyber conflict world. But I'm not so sure that it's easy to have these rules in cyberspace, as it is in what we used to call the real world, but now call the physical world. A third form of conflict has just been pioneered by Russia. Russians have been thinking about this since at least 2007. A lot of their writing about this is online. It's the Academy of Sciences. You can Google it. It's there. It's not a secret. And basically, it's how can you be in conflict with the West in a country like Ukraine without, of course, this becoming a conventional war. And I think the Russians have done quite a lot. First thing I'd say is that the Ukraine crisis is still with us. It's been going on since May last year. The fact that it's still with us means that it can be switched on and off by Moscow whenever it wants. That's the first thing about what the Russians call non-linear or first-generation warfare. Second thing is, of course, that you go through various diplomatic moves to show people that it's not a war. In March last year, the Russian Federation Council authorized President Putin to use armed forces in the invasion of Ukraine, if necessary. In June, the Russian Federation Parliament revoked this decision because they said there was no need for an invasion. Of course there was no need for an invasion. 4,000 soldiers have died so far in the Ukraine because it's a different kind of invasion. It's an invasion in which every 2 months or so the Russians mount exercises, putting 65,000 troops into the field, which could be deployed, if necessary, within 72 hours. NATO can put 4,000 troops into the field after a month. That's about the maximum it can do. But of course you don't actually deploy those forces. You just show that you can. It's an implicit threat. Then there are what's called the little green men, because the green fatigues, or special forces, appearing in the streets of Crimea or in Ukraine. This is not, of course, technically a special force operation. Because so many of them have gone home in body bags, President Putin has been forced to finally acknowledge that they are there, but they are called volunteers. They have volunteered to serve. They have not been sent there by the state. A bit like the 600,000 Chinese volunteers in the Korean War, to a certain extent. And the important thing, of course, is that the actors on the ground are people with whom you have already established contact long before. Power brokers, Ukrainian multimillionaires, criminal gangs. There's a large element of cyber warfare in this, malware, snakeware in particular, against embassies, against NATO on a continual basis since May last year, against Ukrainian armed forces, all plausible deniability, of course. So what is the distinctive feature about non-linear warfare? It is, I think, if we can go back to Clausewitz, look at the essence of war, which is its tendency to escalate. So how do you prevent a war from escalating? First, you don't declare war on the country that you're at war with. Secondly, you don't mount a conventional attack. Thirdly, you don't have contact with the enemy's forces. This is a new form of conflict for what is the real battle in this, which is not a battle between Russia and Ukraine. It's a battle between Russia and the West. That's the future of Ukraine. That's the real conflict. And so far, I think the Russians are probably winning it. Now, what do these three forms of war have in common? I would say the invention of something which I call virtual violence. What is virtual violence? It's very interesting when President Obama named those 5 PLA cyber warfare officials by name as being responsible for cyber attacks in the United States, that in the debate that followed, there was actually no mention of intellectual property theft. Why? Perhaps because China has so much property of the United States already, there's not much point getting any more. Maybe data overload. It's one thing to steal data, it's quite another to turn it into knowledge. You can steal a source code, but you can't necessarily update it unless you have the knowledge. The paradox is that you may not have to hack into systems. You may just have to tell people, we've got your secrets. This is the defining problem for the Americans of the F-35, the most expensive single-weapon system the United States has ever built, with a stealth technology that China does not have, which is why it's of interest to countries that want to buy it in the NATO alliance. The question some of those countries are now asking themselves is, do we wish to buy it if the Chinese have the technology already, if they've stolen it, if they've stolen it, then the F-35 is the greatest white elephant the United States has built. What about Cold War? Well, perceptions matter here too. Can you put a virus in the American aircraft carrier computer system? And I have asked cyber experts who say, yes, it's technically possible. We don't think you can do it now, but we think it is technically possible. It's certainly not impossible. It's not science fiction. It's certainly not science fantasy. In 1998, the USS Yorktown was disabled not by enemy fire, but by a computer that crashed when it was asked to divide by zero. It's a kind of virtual violence. Because in essence, what you are saying to the Americans in this case is, okay, you may wish to engage in something called air-sea battle. You may wish to even think that your naval superiority enables us to take you, you take us on at sea. What happens if there's a virus in the system? It's called by people the risk trap. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You're damned if you go to war against China, but you're also damned if you don't go to war against China. Probably the worst thing is to go to war with the possibility there's viruses in the system. In other words, it kind of paralyzes decision making. It's a virtual violence. It's not the real thing. And non-linear warfare, I think violence here is virtual as well. It's communicated. It communicates a purpose. How the Russians responded to the sanctions against them. Well, one of the things that is not often discussed, but is actually open source, is that they put a virus into JP Morgan's computer system, which means that they can crash a major American bank and possibly precipitate another financial meltdown. Would they wish to do this? Not necessarily. JP Morgan has left, to my knowledge, the virus in the system because they can't get it out. It's a kind of calculated risk, but it's a way of coercing people by suggesting you might one day operationalize what you put in. The point is minimum investment for maximum outcome. So what is virtual violence at the end of the day? I think it's getting into the minds of the opponent. It's getting you to spend hours of your time looking for viruses that may not exist. It's getting you to do violence to yourself because sometimes you have to shut your own systems down for fear that you're about to be attacked. That has happened a couple of times in the United States. And for those of you who want an historical analogy, I would just remind you of what happened many years ago, beginning of the millennium, with the Y2K disaster, where we thought that our computer systems would crash unless we changed the digits from 2 to 4, and we spent billions of dollars doing it to change the software. And most experts would agree that that was an unnecessary expense, but could you take the risk? As one cyber warfare expert says, if you're the enemy of a great power, you make sure it's a Y2K day every day. So to conclude, how likely is another great power conflict? There is a famous Santa Fe mathematician, John Cassidy, in the United States, who divides likelihood into 5 different categories. I think it's quite a good way of concentrating our minds. Category 1 is virtually certain. And clearly this is not the case. History suggests that even rising and status quo powers can live together and coexist peacefully with one another. There are examples of this. Britain and Russia at the end of the 19th century, they did not go to war. Britain and the United States in different circumstances in the 20th century. So it's certainly not virtually certain. Definitely possible is his second category. This is where history takes the center stage. History is not about the study of possibilities, it's the study of probabilities. And I'm afraid that the main reason why countries go to war and societies go to war, with the single exception perhaps of World War II, is because of human nature. Because of misunderstandings, miscomprehension, cognitive dissonance. In other words, it's nothing to do with culture. It is to do with the fact that we are hardwired with inadequate brains. Our brains essentially have not made any great quantum leap in intelligence since the Stone Age. And that is the reality we have to live with. So I'm afraid definitely possible, I would say, is probably where we have to be. Unlikely is the third category, only if there's no record of a past occurrence. I'm afraid there are too many records of past occurrences. And anyway, American Armed Forces these days and you want to make a real future for yourself, it's probably better to learn Chinese than to learn Arabic. And if you're in the Chinese Armed Forces and you want to make a future for yourself, English is going to be the language that you will be obviously encouraged to speak. Both countries translate each other's publications automatically now because they're interested in what the other has to think about the possibility of great power. Very remote is the fourth category that Cassidy identifies, an event so unlikely that it really isn't worth investing too much time and energy in thinking about it. An example for those of you who like films about the future, you may remember The Day After Tomorrow, when the Gulf Stream goes into reverse. Interestingly enough, 2 years ago, the Defense Department of the United States hired a consulting agency to look into that possibility. And they found, in fact, the Gulf Stream is animated much less by temperatures and differences in temperature and salinity than by winds. So there's a piece of completely useless information for you that you can take away with you if you take nothing else from this talk. The point is, of course, if you really thought the great power conflict was very remote, you wouldn't be wasting your time by listening to what I have to say now. You obviously think that it's a possibility. Impossible to say is Cassidy's fifth and most intriguing category. Impossible to say when we're talking about something that has no historical precedent, like an alien invasion of the Earth, or the Second Coming. Although there are 4 out of 10 Americans who believe that Jesus will return in their lifetime, and there are preachers in the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas, who believe that President Obama is the Antichrist, so the end of days is just around the corner. That's prophecy, not prediction, and therefore we can't be engaged in that this afternoon. So is another great power conflict likely? Well, there's much I haven't talked about. I haven't talked about whether a kinetic great power conflict is possible. I said nothing about the greatest danger of all, that a conflict could take place in outer space, in low Earth orbit, although we are already building systems towards that end. And I said nothing about the use of nuclear weapons in a calculated, tactical way, short of an all-out nuclear exchange. There are books written about the possibility of that, of one great power blinking in time and avoiding catastrophe. I think at the end of the day, we can say this, that the great powers are interested in exploring the options on being in conflict with each other. They have not ruled it out. Therefore, what they're interested in, we must be interested in. As for the possibility, I would say, being a pessimist, English is part of the cultural DNA, there's a 50% chance that we may see one in the next 20 years. And that's actually remarkably good historical odds. So you shouldn't be too pessimistic. But then I always say it's rather like being told that last night's asteroid passed the Earth a distance of 50,000 miles, which sounds a hell of a lot, but a cosmologist would say, I'm sorry, that's too close to call. I think what we're looking at is something which is a little too close to call, and therefore we have to open our minds to the possibility, however improbable we think it might be, in the best of all possible worlds.